Margaret had been married for 38 years when she first felt it, that slow, burning sensation in her chest that she couldn't quite name. It happened on a Tuesday morning as she watched her husband Robert shuffle to his recliner with his coffee, newspaper, and the same expectant look he'd worn for decades. The look that said, "What's for dinner tonight?" without him ever having to ask. At 62, Margaret had reached a crossroads that millions of women face, but rarely talk about openly. The children were grown, the mortgage was nearly paid off, and retirement loomed on the horizon like a promise of freedom. Yet instead of feeling excited about this new chapter of life after 60, she felt something else entirely. A deep, unsettling resentment toward the man she'd pledged to love through better or worse. This wasn't the explosive anger of a midlife crisis or the dramatic revelation of infidelity. This was something quieter, more insidious, and perhaps more dangerous to long-term relationships. It was the slow realization that somewhere along the way, she had lost herself in the endless cycle of caring for everyone else's needs while her own dreams gathered dust on the shelf. Margaret's story isn't unique. Across the country, women entering their 60s are discovering that senior empowerment means more than just claiming discounts at the movie theater. It means confronting decades of unspoken expectations, unequal partnerships, and the crushing weight of being the family's emotional caretaker. These women are finding their voices at a time when society often expects them to quietly fade into the background. The statistics are sobering. Divorce rates among couples over 60 have doubled in the past 30 years, with women initiating the majority of these separations. These aren't impulsive decisions made in moments of passion. They're calculated choices made by women who have developed the emotional wisdom to recognize that their remaining years are too precious to spend in relationships that drain rather than fulfill them. But Margaret's journey toward understanding her resentment didn't begin with thoughts of divorce. It started with small moments of clarity that accumulated like drops of water, eventually carving through stone. There was the family dinner where she spent 3 hours cooking while Robert watched television, then complained that the roast was a little dry. There was the vacation she planned entirely by herself while he critiqued her choice of hotels. There were the countless times she bit her tongue when he interrupted her mid-sentence to correct her version of a story they'd both lived through. These weren't earth-shattering betrayals, but they represented something deeper, a pattern of dismissal that had become so normalized she'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. The wake-up call came during a conversation with her longtime friend Patricia, who had recently embraced independent living after her own divorce at 64. "I spent 40 years making myself smaller so he could feel bigger," Patricia had said over coffee. "I'm not doing that anymore." Those words hit Margaret like lightning. She realized she'd been doing the same thing, shrinking her dreams, her opinions, her very presence to accommodate a man who had grown comfortable with her sacrifice. The question that haunted her wasn't whether she still loved Robert, but whether she could continue to love him without losing herself completely. As Margaret sat in her garden that evening, watching the sun set over the roses she'd planted 20 years ago, she wondered if other women her age were feeling this same quiet desperation. She wondered if there was a way to bridge the growing chasm between who she had been and who she was becoming, between the life she'd built and the life she still wanted to live. The answer to that question would change everything. But first, she needed to understand exactly what had gone wrong and whether it was too late to make it right. Hashtag Chapter 2, The Weight of Choices. Margaret's path to this moment of reckoning hadn't been sudden. It had been building for years, perhaps decades, in ways she was only now beginning to understand. As she reflected on her life after retirement, she found herself revisiting memories she'd buried under the daily demands of raising children and managing a household. She remembered the young woman she'd been at 24, fresh out of college with a teaching degree and dreams of making a difference in children's lives. That woman had plans, not just to marry Robert, but to travel during summer breaks, to pursue a master's degree, maybe even to write the children's books that lived in her imagination. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The babies came quickly, 3 children in 5 years, and with them came a reshuffling of priorities that felt temporary at the time, but somehow became permanent. Robert's career in sales demanded long hours and frequent travel, leaving Margaret to manage everything on the home front. It was a practical arrangement that made sense then, but somewhere in the fog of diapers and school pickups and soccer practices, her own dreams had been quietly shelved. Now, facing life after retirement with Robert already settled into his daily routine of golf and television, Margaret was confronting a painful truth. She had spent 40 years being someone else's support system without ever asking who would support her dreams. The emotional resilience she'd built from years of managing crisis after crisis, sick children, elderly parents, financial setbacks, had served everyone except herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become incredibly capable over the decades, the person everyone turned to when things got complicated. Her adult children still called her first when they needed advice, babysitting, or someone to listen to their problems. Her neighbors relied on her to organize block parties and coordinate meal trains for families in crisis. Even Robert's mother, before she passed, had always preferred Margaret's company to her own son's. But all that competence, all that giving, had come at a cost she was only now tallying. Senior reflection had a way of stripping away the justifications and excuses, leaving only the stark reality of choices made and paths not taken. She'd been so busy being indispensable to everyone else that she'd become dispensable to herself. The wake-up call had started small. It was Robert's casual dismissal of her suggestion that they take a pottery class together at the community center. "That's not really my thing," he'd said without looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Why don't you go with one of your girlfriends?" The assumption that she would simply adapt, again, to his preferences had stung more than usual. Later that week, she'd attended her high school reunion alone because Robert claimed he didn't see the point in pretending to care about people we barely knew 40 years ago. Standing in the decorated gymnasium, surrounded by classmates who were enthusiastically sharing stories about post-career adventures and newfound passions, Margaret had felt invisible. Not because she wasn't accomplished, she was proud of the family she'd raised and the volunteer work she'd done, but because she couldn't answer the simple question, "What are you excited about now?" Finding purpose in this new phase of life seemed like such a luxury when she'd spent decades believing that other people's needs were inherently more important than her own. The women at the reunion talked about starting businesses, learning languages, taking art classes, traveling solo. They spoke with the confidence of people who had permission to want things for themselves. Margaret realized she'd forgotten how to want. Worse, she'd forgotten that wanting was allowed. The drive home from the reunion had been silent, Robert snoring softly in the passenger seat while she navigated dark country roads and darker thoughts. Well, had she stopped being a person with desires and become simply a role? Wife, mother, helper, fixer? When had Robert stopped seeing her as someone with her own inner world worth exploring and started treating her like a comfortable piece of furniture that required little maintenance? These questions followed her into sleepless nights and quiet morning hours when Robert was still asleep and the house belonged only to her. In those stolen moments of solitude, she began to remember fragments of the woman she used to be, the one who laughed at inappropriate jokes, who had opinions about politics and art, who once spent an entire Saturday reading poetry just because it made her feel alive. But remembering who she'd been only made the distance between then and now feel more vast. The question that haunted her wasn't just about resentment toward Robert. It was about whether she could find her way back to herself after so many years of being someone else entirely. Hashtag Chapter 3, The Unspoken Contract. The shift in Margaret's awareness began to accelerate after a conversation with her oldest daughter, Sarah, who had called to vent about her own marital struggles. As Margaret listened to Sarah describe feeling unheard and undervalued by her husband, she felt an uncomfortable recognition creep up her spine. "He just assumes I'll handle everything," Sarah complained. "The kid schedules, the grocery shopping, remembering his mother's birthday. And when I try to talk to him about wanting to go back to school, he says we can't afford it, but somehow there's always money for his golf membership." Margaret found herself nodding along, but the words that came out of her mouth surprised her. "Honey, Maybe you need to stop asking for permission and start making decisions for yourself. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Margaret to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah's voice came back, quieter now. Mom, when's the last time you made a decision just for yourself? The question hung in the air between them, like a challenge neither was ready to fully address. After they hung up, Margaret sat staring at the phone, realizing that her daughter had unknowingly put her finger on the heart of the problem. At what point had she begun treating her own life like a democracy where everyone else got a vote except her? Finding purpose after decades of defining herself through other people's needs felt like learning to walk again after a long illness. The skills were still there, somewhere, but atrophied from disuse. She began small, signing up for a watercolor class at the senior center without mentioning it to Robert. The first day, she sat in the back row feeling fraudulent, surrounded by women who chatted easily about their art supplies and previous classes. But when she put brush to paper for the first time in 40 years, something stirred inside her that she'd almost forgotten existed. It wasn't about creating masterpieces. Her first attempts were muddy and uncertain. It was about the pure joy of doing something solely because it brought her pleasure. No one needed her paintings. No one was depending on them. They existed simply because she wanted them to exist. Robert's reaction when he discovered her art supplies was telling. "I didn't know you painted," he said, picking up one of her practice pieces with the same expression he might use to examine a curiosity at a garage sale. "I used to, in college," she replied, watching his face carefully. "Well, that's nice, I suppose. Good hobby for retirement." He set the painting down without really looking at it and reached for the remote control. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that Margaret wondered if he even realized he'd done it. This pattern of casual dismissal, she was beginning to understand, had shaped their relationship in ways both subtle and profound. Robert wasn't malicious or deliberately cruel. He was simply a man who had grown comfortable with a version of marriage where his interests were central and hers were peripheral. He'd never had to question this arrangement because she'd never challenged it. The emotional resilience she'd developed over the years had been focused outward, helping others weather their storms while weathering her own in silence. Now, for the first time, she was turning that strength inward, using it to examine her own life with the same careful attention she'd always given to everyone else's problems. Senior reflection, she was learning, could be both liberating and terrifying. Each memory she excavated revealed another small compromise, another moment when she'd chosen peace over authenticity. The accumulation was staggering. How many times had she laughed at Robert's jokes that weren't funny? How many dinner parties had she hosted when she would have preferred a quiet evening with a book? How many family decisions had been made based on what was easiest for everyone else? She began keeping a small notebook, not to document grievances, but to rediscover preferences she'd buried so deeply she'd forgotten they existed. She preferred herbal tea to coffee. She liked documentaries better than sitcoms. She enjoyed quiet mornings more than busy evenings filled with social obligations. These weren't earth-shattering revelations, but they felt revolutionary to a woman who hadn't consulted her own preferences in decades. The most difficult realization was that Robert had no idea who she really was because she'd stopped showing him years ago. She'd become so skilled at anticipating and accommodating his needs that she'd forgotten to express her own. They'd fallen into a pattern where her silence was interpreted as contentment, her adaptability as lack of strong preferences. But now that she was paying attention, she could see the cost of that silence everywhere. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in March, forwarded from her old address through a chain of postal redirections that had somehow tracked her down after 23 years. Margaret stared at the return address, Riverside Elementary School, and felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with memory. Inside, the principal's handwriting was warm but formal. The school was celebrating its centennial and creating a memorial garden dedicated to teachers who had made lasting impacts on their students. Several former students, now adults with children of their own, had specifically requested that Margaret be honored. They remembered her third-grade classroom, they said, as the place where they first learned to love reading, where they felt safe to ask questions, where they discovered that learning could be joyful. "We would be honored if you would consider participating in the dedication ceremony," the letter concluded. "Your former students would love to reconnect and share how you changed their lives." Margaret set the letter down with trembling hands. She had taught for only 5 years before the children came, but those years had been among the most fulfilling of her life. She'd poured her heart into creating a classroom environment where every child felt valued, where struggling readers received extra attention, where creativity was celebrated alongside academic achievement. When she'd resigned to focus on her growing family, she told herself it was temporary. The years had proven otherwise. Now, decades later, those children remembered her. They wanted to honor her. The woman who had spent recent months questioning her worth, wondering if she'd made any meaningful contribution to the world beyond her own family, was being told that her brief teaching career had created ripples she'd never known existed. Robert's reaction to the letter was predictably dismissive. "That's ancient history, Margaret. Why would you want to drive 3 hours to see a bunch of strangers?" He didn't understand that they weren't strangers. They were pieces of her authentic self that had been waiting patiently for her to remember them. The decision to attend the ceremony felt like the first real choice she'd made in years. She bought a new dress, practiced what she might say if called upon to speak, and felt a flutter of anticipation she hadn't experienced since her children were young. This was rediscovery after 60 in its purest form. Not just finding new interests, but reclaiming pieces of herself that had never truly disappeared. The ceremony was held on a bright Saturday morning, and as Margaret walked across the school grounds, she was struck by how much smaller everything seemed. The playground where she'd supervised recess, the hallway where she'd posted student artwork, the classroom that had been hers, all compressed by time and perspective, yet somehow still magical. But it was the faces of her former students that broke her open completely. Adults now, with graying hair and laugh lines, but their eyes lit up when they saw her with the same wonder she remembered from story time. They surrounded her with hugs and stories, telling her about careers inspired by her encouragement, about the confidence she'd helped them build, about moments in her classroom that had shaped their entire lives. "Mrs. Foster," said a woman who must have been Jennifer Chun, the shy girl who had struggled with reading, "you used to stay after school to help me with phonics. You told me that words were just puzzles waiting to be solved. I became a librarian because of you. I tell struggling readers the same thing you told me." Another former student, now a father of 3, pressed a photograph into her hands. "This is my son reading the same book you read to us, Where the Wild Things Are. I bought it because I remembered how your voice sounded when you read it to our class. You made books come alive." Standing in that garden, surrounded by testament to her impact, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about recognition or validation. This was about remembering that she had been someone significant, someone whose work mattered, someone who had touched lives in ways both profound and lasting. The career she'd abandoned hadn't disappeared. It lived on in the dozens of people who carried pieces of her teaching with them every day. For the first time in months, she understood that her resentment toward Robert wasn't really about him at all. It was about the parts of herself she'd allowed to go dormant, the talents she'd buried, the woman of purpose and passion she'd somehow forgotten she used to be. New beginnings, she realized, didn't always mean starting over. Sometimes they meant remembering who you'd always been underneath all the roles you'd learned to play. The drive home from the ceremony was different than any journey Margaret had taken in years. She felt like she was carrying light inside her chest, a warm recognition of her own worth that had been missing for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. But more than that, she carried a revelation that would change everything about how she approached her marriage and her life. The wisdom with age that everyone talked about had finally arrived, not as gradual understanding, but as a sudden, crystal-clear moment of truth. She had spent decades resenting Robert for not seeing her, not valuing her contributions, not recognizing her dreams. But the real tragedy wasn't his blindness. It was her own complicity in making herself invisible. When she walked through her front door that evening, Robert was in his usual spot, remote control in hand, barely glancing up as she entered. For months, this scene had filled her with quiet rage. Tonight, it filled her with something else entirely: compassion. Not for him, but for both of them. They had created this dynamic together, each playing their assigned roles so completely that they'd forgotten there had ever been a choice. Margaret sat down across from Robert, something she rarely did during his television time. He looked at her with mild surprise, the expression of a man whose routine was being gently disrupted. In that moment, she saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in years, not as the enemy of her dreams, but as a man who had also been sleepwalking through the past decade, following patterns that had calcified into habit rather than intention. The conversation that followed wasn't the confrontation she had rehearsed in her mind for months. Instead, it was the most honest dialogue they had in years. She told him about the ceremony, about the students who remembered her, about the teacher she used to be, and the woman she was remembering herself to be. She spoke without anger or accusation, simply sharing the truth of her rediscovery. Robert listened in a way he hadn't listened to her in years, perhaps because she was speaking from a place of strength rather than resentment. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before saying something that surprised them both. "I married a teacher, didn't I? Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I think I forgot a lot of things about who you were before you became just my wife." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. This was their life's turning point after 60, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because they were finally seeing each other clearly again. Margaret realized that her resentment had been a shield protecting her from a deeper fear, that she had lost herself so completely there was no way back. The ceremony had proven that wasn't true. The woman she'd been was still there, waiting to be reclaimed. But the most unexpected twist came when Robert asked if he could drive her to the next school event. "I'd like to meet some of these students of yours," he said. "I'd like to see you the way they see you." It wasn't a grand gesture or a complete transformation, but it was recognition. It was the beginning of him seeing her not just as the woman who managed his life, but as the woman who had shaped other lives in profound ways. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not naive optimism, but the mature hope that comes with understanding that emotional closure doesn't always mean endings. Sometimes it means new beginnings built on firmer ground. She had found her way back to herself not by leaving her marriage, but by refusing to abandon herself within it. The teacher who had once helped children discover their potential was finally ready to help herself do the same. At 62, she was learning the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to remember who you really are, and it's never too late to insist that others remember too. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her new studio space, a converted corner of their basement that Robert had helped her transform. The walls were lined with her watercolor paintings, some amateur but improving, others surprisingly accomplished. The easel by the window caught the morning light perfectly, and the small bookshelf held volumes on art technique alongside the journals she'd started keeping again. The changes in their daily life hadn't been dramatic, but they'd been profound. Margaret no longer asked permission to pursue her interests. She joined the art guild at the community center, volunteered to teach reading to adult learners at the library, and even started a small painting class for other women her age. Robert had initially been surprised by her sudden assertiveness, but he'd adapted faster than she'd expected. More importantly, he'd begun to engage with her new activities rather than simply tolerate them. Their relationship hadn't become perfect overnight. They still had moments of friction, times when old patterns threatened to resurface. But something fundamental had shifted. Margaret had learned to occupy her full space in their shared life, and Robert had learned to make room for the woman he'd married rather than just the role she'd been playing. The dinner conversations that had once centered entirely on his golf game or the news now included discussions about her art, her volunteer work, her thoughts on books she was reading. When friends visited, Robert would often suggest they see Margaret's latest paintings, a small gesture that meant the world to her because it showed he was finally seeing her accomplishments as worthy of celebration. Perhaps most surprisingly, their physical intimacy had improved. Not because they'd addressed it directly, but because Margaret's growing sense of self-worth had changed how she moved through the world. She stood straighter, spoke with more confidence, and smiled more genuinely. Robert had begun noticing her again, not as a familiar fixture, but as a woman with her own inner life and passions. The timeless lessons Margaret had learned weren't particularly revolutionary, but they were transformative in their simplicity. She discovered that senior resilience wasn't about enduring whatever life handed you, but about actively choosing how to respond to it. She'd learned that dignity in aging came not from accepting diminishment, but from refusing to let others diminish you. Most importantly, she'd realized that love, real, lasting love, required both people to remain fully themselves rather than disappearing into their roles. Her story had become one of life's quiet victories, the kind that don't make headlines, but change everything for the people who live them. When younger women asked her about maintaining long marriages, she no longer offered the tired advice about compromise and sacrifice. Instead, she told them about the importance of staying visible to themselves and their partners, about the courage required to grow within relationships rather than despite them. Margaret's watercolor class had grown into a small community of women rediscovering themselves after decades of serving others. They called themselves the late bloomers, and their Thursday afternoon sessions were filled with laughter, honest conversation, and the gentle sound of brushes on paper. Many of them shared similar stories of awakening, of learning to value their own dreams alongside their devotion to family. The woman who had once felt invisible now understood that she had always been there, waiting patiently for permission to be seen. The greatest gift of her 60s wasn't the absence of challenge, but the presence of choice. She could choose to remain curious about life, to keep growing, to honor both her commitment to Robert and her commitment to herself. In the end, that choice had saved not just her sense of self, but their marriage as well. Some of life's most important lessons, she'd learned, come not from starting over, but from the courage to finally, fully begin.